Most of us believe that our external circumstances determine our happiness and fulfillment. However, this is a mistaken belief. Our personal hell or heaven is not created by external events, but by our own thoughts and actions. We are the architects of our own misery, whether we realize it or not. While the concepts of heaven and hell are often associated with Christian beliefs about afterlife, where heaven is often described as a place of joy, peace, and eternal life, and hell as a place of eternal suffering. They can also be understood as metaphors for the state of our inner world. In other words, we can think of heaven as a state of inner peace, joy, and fulfillment, while hell can represent inner turmoil, unhappiness, and suffering. These states are not dependent on religious beliefs or the belief in an afterlife, but rather on our own perceptions and experiences in the present moment. When we talk about personal hell, we are referring to the idea of a subjective experience of suffering or unhappiness. This can be related to our physical, emotional, or spiritual state. It may involve experiences like chronic pain, depression, anxiety, loneliness, grief, or trauma. Personal hell may also refer to toxic relationships, addiction, abuse, or other challenging life circumstances. Everyone's personal hell is different. To better clarify this perspective, we can rely on the following quote by John Milton.
The mind is its own place and, in itself, can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven.
John Milton was a deeply religious man who also had a strong sense of intellectual and artistic independence. He was a poet, polemicist, and political philosopher, but he also suffered many personal tragedies. Born in London in 1608 to a well-off family, Milton went to prestigious schools and then to Cambridge University, where he studied literature, philosophy, and theology. In 1632, he began working as a private tutor in London, and by 1638, he had completed his most famous poem, Lycidas. Throughout his life, Milton was an active political thinker and writer. He was a passionate defender of the Puritan cause during the English Civil War and a fierce critic of the monarchy. He also wrote many political tracts in support of the Commonwealth of England. When Milton said, "The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven," he was speaking from a place of deep personal experience. Milton's first major tragedy was the death of his first wife, Mary Powell, in 1652. This loss had a profound impact on him, both emotionally and spiritually. In his writing, he described the pain of losing a loved one and the process of grieving and healing. In his poem, Lycidas, Milton explores the pain of losing a friend. He writes about the process of grief and the search for solace in nature and faith. He describes the cycle of emotions that one goes through after a loss. Another of Milton's hells was his growing blindness. This began in 1652, when he started to experience problems with his vision. 2 years later, he was completely blind. In his poem, When I Consider How My Light Is Spent, he describes the physical and emotional impact of blindness. Milton's next major hell was the English Civil War and the execution of King Charles. Another hell that Milton faced was the censorship of his work by the Commonwealth government. One of Milton's final hells was the death of his daughter, Mary, in 1673. In his poem, On the Death of a Fair Infant, Dying of a Cough, he expresses his grief and despair at this loss. He describes the child's death as a wholly innocent and questions why such tragedies occur. This poem reflects Milton's belief in a higher power and his struggle to find meaning in suffering and loss. The heaven of hell and hell of heaven refer to the idea that our mindset determines our experience, regardless of our external circumstances. John Milton's life experiences were the inspiration for this famous quote. Milton was a poet who was blind for most of his life, and this experience impacted his perspective on the world. He believed that our minds have the power to create our own reality, regardless of our circumstances. Milton's statement suggests that our thoughts play a crucial role in determining our happiness and success. He argues that our internal dialogue, beliefs, and expectations influence how we perceive and react to the world around us. In other words, we can choose to focus on the positive or negative aspects of our lives, regardless of our circumstances. When we talk about heaven and hell, it isn't only limited to the spiritual realm. Heaven and hell could also be built within us, in our thoughts and in our minds. Some common examples include feeling trapped in a job we hate, being stuck in a toxic relationship, living with chronic illness or pain, dealing with mental health challenges, or being in an abusive situation. Other forms of hell may be more subtle, such as feeling dissatisfied with life or lacking a sense of purpose. These are the kinds of walls we build for ourselves in our minds. These various hells trap us in our minds and give us some sort of mental stagnation. They make us feel like we aren't enough and we always need to do better. They make us feel like we aren't where we ought to be because we see others doing more. In our society, hell could mean something more physical. We live in a world where the less privileged are victims of poverty, wars, famine, marginalization, floods, murder, injustice, genocides, theft, and other forms of crisis. Lance von Liebenfels wrote about many different forms of racial abuse and hells in his work. One example is the idea of racial segregation, where people of different races were forced to live apart from each other. This was often accompanied by violence, intimidation, and dehumanization. Lanz also wrote about forced sterilization, forced adoption, and the killing of inferior races. His views were used to justify some of the worst human rights violations in history, including the Holocaust. Lance von Liebenfels argued that people of different races should be kept separate, and that inferior races should not be allowed to reproduce. He wrote about how people of certain races were degenerate and should be prevented from passing on their bad traits to future generations. To accomplish this, he advocated for forced sterilization and the removal of children from inferior families. He also promoted the idea of a master race of Aryan people who are superior to all others. It's clear that his ideas caused a great deal of harm and suffering. Today, hells comes in more advanced forms. People tend to go through issues like gender-based violence, domestic violence, human trafficking, abusive or toxic relationships, exploitation of workers in job sites, homelessness, and more. Finally, while others consider hell as a state of mental abuse that can lead to feelings of isolation, despair, and hopelessness, others see it as a more realistic phenomenon, which has been practiced over the ages and is still being practiced till date by some humans who think they are superior than others. The cycle of abuse and mental suffering can create a self-perpetuating hell that is hard to escape. Which of the above categories do you fall in? Do you think you can escape from this physical and mental doom? Please let me know in the comments section, and it will be my pleasure to read through your story and recommendations.